Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Sino-Soviet border conflict of 1969. Let's set the stage. Picture the late 1940s and early 1950s. Two communist giants, fresh from war and revolution, look across Eurasia and nod to each other. We share a creed, we share enemies, so we should share a future. In practice, early solidarity was real. Mao's new People's Republic of China recognized the Soviet Union as the senior revolutionary state. Moscow extended advice, factories, and technical specialists. Beijing supplied ideological zeal and manpower. Both spoke Marxist-Leninist, both distrusted Western intentions, and both imagined history bending toward them. But here's the twist that matters for everything to come. The partnership was never equal. From the first days of cooperation, the Soviet Union played the part of elder brother. It ran the larger economy, the larger military, and the global messaging of the communist movement. China, devastated by decades of civil war and invasion, entered the relationship in a junior role. That hierarchy solved problems at first. Someone pays the bills, someone sets the timetable, but it also bred resentment. If you were in Beijing, how long would you accept being lectured on what true socialism required? Now slide forward to the 1950s and 1960s, when the warmth began to cool. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev denounced the old terror and promoted what he called peaceful coexistence with the West. To Chinese leaders, that sounded less like strategy and more like surrender. Meanwhile, practical disputes piled up. Who controlled aid projects and on what terms? Whose military doctrine would guide joint planning? Which capital had the right to speak for world revolution? Each policy memo, each cancelled loan, each public jab over ideology turned cooperation into competition. It is amazing how quickly a movement built on unity can fracture once prestige and control are on the table. Layered underneath the slogans was something older and far touchier: the border. Along thousands of miles, treaties from the 19th century, agreements China later labeled unequal, had drawn lines that looked neat on paper but messy on the ground. Rivers shift. Islands appear to sit in the middle but belong to one bank or the other depending on how you read the current. Survey markers disappear in snow and taiga. Add national pride, historical grievances, and different legal interpretations, and that neat map becomes a field of tripwires. So by the late 1960s, you had four combustible elements stacked together. First, the memory of genuine solidarity, which made the split feel like betrayal rather than mere policy disagreement. Second, a built-in power imbalance, with Moscow accustomed to leading and Beijing increasingly unwilling to follow. Third, a decade of ideological and strategic friction, aid terms, foreign policy lines, military doctrines, that turned every committee meeting into a contest. And fourth, a border whose very history whispered insult and whose geography invited misunderstanding. Not exactly a recipe for calm. If you're sensing a broader pattern, you're right. Centralized movements often promise cohesion, yet the struggle over who directs the center can be fiercest among allies who agree on almost everything in theory. The more unified the ideology, the higher the stakes when it comes to status and control. And when status contests meet ambiguous borders, patrols and speeches start doing the talking. Hold that picture in your head: shared ideology, unequal partnership, mounting quarrels, and old maps that never quite match the river in front of you. That is the world just before 1969, the moment when what had been a cold rivalry began to produce sparks on the ice. Now that we've set the geopolitical stage, let's zoom in on how ideology and raw power mixed into a combustible brew. The Sino-Soviet split wasn't just about territory or pride, it was about whose vision of revolution would lead the communist world. In Beijing, Mao's China saw itself as the keeper of revolutionary purity. Their model? A peasant-led insurgency, the kind that had brought them to power against all odds. They believed revolution should erupt from the ground up, fueled by the masses in the countryside, sweeping away old orders through sheer determination and sacrifice. Moscow, on the other hand, favored a more centralized, state-led approach, slow, calculated, and grounded in the machinery of the state. To them, revolution was something to be managed, directed, and contained, not a wildfire to be left to its own course. Two strategies, two egos, and only one global stage. The rift deepened after the Cuban Missile Crisis. To China, the Soviets' decision to pull back their missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise looked like capitulation. Mao and his inner circle saw it as a betrayal, not just of Cuba, but of the revolutionary cause itself. In their eyes, Moscow had blinked in front of imperialism. Imagine being an ambitious younger partner and watching the senior ally, your so-called leader, make a deal with your sworn enemy. Trust erodes quickly in moments like that. And then came the nuclear factor. In 1964, China detonated its first atomic bomb, announcing to the world, and to Moscow, that they were no longer a junior player in the strategic game. But instead of solidarity, the test stirred fear in the Kremlin. The Soviets worried about losing their monopoly on nuclear influence within the communist bloc. If China had its own arsenal, it could chart an independent course and challenge Moscow's dominance outright. The arms race had just gotten a lot more complicated. But sometimes, it's the symbols that cut the deepest. The Ussuri River, winding and frozen in winter, became more than a line on a map. It became a stage for proving legitimacy. Patrol boats, soldiers on the banks, and flags planted in disputed spots weren't just about territory, they were about showing the world who had the right to speak for communism itself. Every uniformed stare across that river was a political statement. Every step on contested ground was a message to the other side: we belong here, and we will not yield. By the late 1960s, ideology and geopolitics were no longer separate threads. They were tangled into one knot. Disputes over how to run the revolution had merged with military calculations, nuclear fears, and symbolic challenges over pride and legitimacy. It was no longer just a political disagreement, it was a rivalry for the soul and the leadership of the communist movement worldwide. And that rivalry was about to find a very specific and very icy battleground. Now we arrive at the frozen heart of the conflict, Shenbao Island, known to the Soviets as Demansky. On the surface, it's a tiny scrap of land in the middle of the Ussuri River. But in geopolitics, size isn't everything, symbolism is. This island sat in a grey zone of sovereignty. The river's shifting channels and those old 19th century treaties meant both sides could claim it without technically lying. And in an era of mistrust, that's all it took to turn a sandbar into a powder keg. Throughout February and into early March of 1969, patrols from both countries began encountering each other on the island with greater frequency. At first, it was tense standoffs, soldiers staring each other down, neither willing to step back. Then came the shouts, the pointed rifles, the careful shuffling into position. Every patrol knew they were not just walking the snow, they were walking the knife's edge of national pride. Each encounter ended without open fire, but the temperature, metaphorically speaking, kept dropping below zero. Then, on March 2nd, that knife's edge gave way. The Chinese People's Liberation Army set a deliberate ambush for a Soviet patrol. This wasn't a spontaneous skirmish. It was planned, calculated, and executed with precision. When the Soviets stepped onto the island, Chinese forces opened fire, killing dozens and seizing weapons and positions. For Beijing, it was a signal. China was willing to draw blood to defend what it saw as its rightful ground. But Moscow was not going to let that stand. 13 days later, on March 15th, the Soviets counterattacked with tanks and heavy artillery. The island, once quiet under a crust of ice, became a war zone. Its snow churned into mud and ash. Shells rained down, casualties climbed, and all of it was happening in a place so small you could walk across it in minutes. This is the paradox of border conflicts. The land itself is often insignificant in practical terms, but the control of it becomes priceless as a symbol. Shenbao was now more than an island, it was a measure of resolve. Each side believed that to lose here, even on a frozen speck in the river, would mean losing credibility everywhere else. And as artillery thundered over a strip of ice and snow, both sides began thinking the unthinkable. What if this little island was the first step toward a much bigger war? Here's where the story takes a chilling turn, quite literally to the brink of nuclear war. After the bloodshed on Shenbao Island, Soviet leaders began weighing an option so extreme it almost defies belief: a preemptive nuclear strike on China's nuclear facilities. Their logic was cold and strategic. If Beijing's ambitions were fueled by its growing nuclear capability, then destroying that capability could lock China back into a position of dependence. To Moscow, it wasn't just about punishing China for the ambush, it was about preventing a long-term strategic rival from emerging inside the communist bloc. But the Soviets weren't making these calculations in a vacuum. American intelligence picked up on diplomatic signals from Moscow, messages fishing for US neutrality, or at least a tacit nod that Washington wouldn't interfere if a localized nuclear strike took place. In the chessboard of the Cold War, this was a rare moment when your main adversary's enemy was also your enemy, and that made for dangerous possibilities. If the United States had quietly agreed, history might have turned in a far darker direction. China, for its part, took the threat seriously. Beijing mobilized its national militia, prepared evacuation plans, and fortified underground command centers. Civil defense drills weren't just for show, they were rehearsals for survival. In the capital, leaders huddled in bunkers, weighing whether the Soviets were bluffing or if a mushroom cloud could soon rise over Chinese soil. But even in that high-stakes moment, mutual vulnerability acted as a brake. Neither side had unlimited nuclear delivery systems, and both knew that any strike risked spiraling into a full-scale nuclear exchange. The Soviets feared a long, grinding war with a mobilized China, and China knew that retaliating against a superpower could invite annihilation. The very terror of the nuclear age, the knowledge that neither side could win without losing everything kept the world from crossing the line. Still, think about it, a remote island clash had escalated, in a matter of days, into serious talk of nuclear strikes. It's a reminder that in geopolitics, small sparks can leap into infernos with shocking speed. And once leaders start framing decisions in terms of now or never, the margin for error disappears. The immediate crisis would cool, but not because anyone suddenly trusted the other. No, cooler heads prevailed because the abyss stared back, and both sides flinched. After the near-nuclear brink, both Moscow and Beijing needed a way to step back without appearing weak. That's the delicate dance of power politics. You have to ease the pressure while still looking like you've held your ground. The first real step toward calming the situation came in September of 1969, when Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin stopped in Beijing on his way back from a state funeral in Hanoi. It was meant to be a quick, almost casual meeting with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, but in reality, it was a critical signal. They talked, face to face, about the fighting, the border, and the risks of letting things spiral again. No grand treaty emerged, no detailed map was redrawn, but the ice began to crack, and that mattered. However, let's not imagine that a handshake in Beijing suddenly solved decades of mistrust. The underlying disputes remained unresolved. The border itself was still a line drawn through contested history. Soviet troops continued to guard their side with heavy weapons, and China kept its forces on alert. If anything, both sides used the lull to rearm, fortify, and make sure that the next time tensions rose, they'd be better prepared. The deeper fallout wasn't just about geography, it was about the global balance of the Cold War. The Sino-Soviet split, now openly hostile, created an opportunity for the United States. Washington began to see Beijing not just as a communist rival, but as a potential counterweight to Moscow. This shift paved the way for the famous Nixon visit to China in 1972, and a triangular diplomacy that reshaped Cold War strategy. For China, the conflict confirmed a hard truth: it could not rely on ideological brotherhood to guarantee security. The new priority was self-reliance, developing industries, modernizing the military, and expanding ties beyond the Soviet orbit. For the Soviet Union, it was a reminder that even amongst opposed allies, the threat of defection and competition was very real. And here's the long shadow: even after the shooting stopped, the border remained a point of tension for decades. It wasn't until the early 2000s, more than 30 years later, that the two countries finally settled most of their boundary disputes. That's a whole generation growing up under the cloud of an unfinished argument. It's a pattern you see often in history. Wars and near-wars may end with talks, but if the root causes aren't resolved, the mistrust lingers. And in this case, that mistrust was about far more than a frozen island. It was about sovereignty, prestige, and survival in a world where alliances were never as solid as they looked on paper. So what does a frozen river clash in 1969 have to do with today? More than you might think. If you look at modern China or Russia relations, you'll see official smiles, strategic agreements, and talk of partnership against Western pressure. On the surface, it might look like the bad blood of the past is gone, but underneath, the old fault lines still run deep. The border may be settled on paper, but history has a way of sticking around in the minds of leaders. Mistrust is a quiet shadow. It doesn't make the headlines every day, but it shapes decisions in subtle, lasting ways. Today's cooperation between the two countries is driven largely by convenience and shared opposition to Western dominance, not by deep ideological unity. In fact, the ideological component is weaker than ever. It's pragmatic geopolitics. They trade resources, sign defense agreements, and coordinate in some areas, but both keep a wary eye on the other's growing influence. Russia doesn't forget that China now has the stronger economy, and China doesn't forget that Russia still commands a massive nuclear arsenal. The lesson? Sovereignty always trumps ideology when the two come into conflict. In 1969, both nations proved they would defend their borders and their national pride even against a supposed comrade. In the 21st century, that reality hasn't changed. If push comes to shove, each will protect its own interests first. And there's another thread worth pulling: the trade-off between economic and geopolitical priorities. Both China and Russia today face choices about how far to lean into their partnership without risking too much dependence. The deeper they cooperate, the greater the risk that one side gains leverage over the other, whether in energy, trade, or security. It's a delicate balance that echoes the old days, even if the players have swapped roles in some respects. For anyone watching from the outside, the 1969 conflict is a case study in how quickly alliances can fray when underlying tensions aren't addressed. The public narrative of unity can mask deep divisions, and when those divisions surface, they can turn symbolic disputes into real danger. The border clash is a reminder that even small-scale conflicts can reshape global alignments for decades. So next time you hear about a China-Russia summit, remember Yanbo Island. Remember that beneath the polite speeches and photo ops is a history that once brought them to the brink of war, and could, under the wrong conditions, make them rivals again. History has a way of turning on moments that seem small at the time. Yanbo Island was a patch of ice and soil barely big enough to hold a football field, yet it dragged two of the world's most powerful nations to the edge of nuclear war. Why? Because in the realm of power politics, symbols carry weight far beyond their physical size. Control of that island was never just about geography, it was about credibility, sovereignty, and the willingness to defend them at any cost. The Sino-Soviet border conflict is more than a Cold War footnote. It's a reminder that centralized systems, whether political or military, create pressures that can make compromise look like defeat. Leaders in both Moscow and Beijing felt they could not yield without undermining their legitimacy, not just abroad, but at home. That's the trap of absolute control. Once you've tied your image to unshakable strength, even the smallest concession can look like weakness. It also shows how fragile alliances really are. These two nations shared ideology, trade, and a common enemy, yet they nearly destroyed each other over a strip of riverbank. It's a pattern seen throughout history. When two powers share too much in common, their rivalry for leadership can be even sharper than the hostility they feel toward outsiders. And perhaps most importantly, it's a cautionary tale about escalation. The conflict went from icy standoffs to artillery exchanges to nuclear war planning in a matter of weeks. That speed should make us pause. Once events begin to spiral, the time for measured decision-making evaporates. Leaders act under pressure, mistrust magnifies every signal, and the world edges closer to irreversible consequences. So as we look at today's geopolitical landscape, with shifting alliances and rising tensions, the lesson is clear: history doesn't just repeat, it mutates. The triggers may change, but the underlying forces of pride, fear, and power remain constant. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden currents of the Cold War, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. And if you want to dig even deeper into the stories that shaped our world, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description. You'll find more tales that challenge the official record and reveal the forces behind the events. And of course, if thoughtful and entertaining history is your thing, stick around, there's always more to uncover.